My friend Madison asked me to pick up her wedding dress from alterations while she was stuck at work, dealing with a client emergency. She said to make sure I didn't let her fiancé Jake see it, because he was superstitious about the groom seeing the dress before the wedding. I was walking out of the bridal shop when Jake pulled up in the parking lot looking panicked. He rushed over saying Madison had sent him to get the dress because there was some mix-up with the pickup date. My stomach dropped because Madison specifically said she'd handle everything and Jake would be at his bachelor party planning meeting all afternoon. He reached for the garment bag, but I instinctively pulled it back. "Just give me the dress," he said, grabbing my wrist. Not hard, but firm enough to make me uncomfortable. Other customers walking by started to stare. He let go and laughed nervously, saying he was just stressed about wedding details, but his eyes stayed locked on the garment bag like it contained state secrets. I started walking toward my car, and Jake followed right beside me, asking questions about whether Madison had seemed okay when she dropped it off, if she'd said anything specific about last-minute changes. His phone kept buzzing, and I saw texts from Madison asking where he was, why he wasn't at the venue meeting. Was everything okay with the catering discussion? He ignored them and moved closer to me, saying he really needed to check if the alterations were done right. I said the bag was sealed and the shop had already approved everything, but he said mistakes happen all the time. No big deal. Just a quick peek to make sure it was perfect for Saturday. An elderly man loading his car nearby asked if everything was all right, and Jake snapped at him to mind his own business. The shop employees inside were starting to look out the window at us. Jake noticed the attention and lowered his voice, but his hand kept twitching toward the bag. He started talking about how brides get crazy before weddings, how they make emotional decisions, how Madison had been acting strange lately. The way he said it made my skin crawl. When I reached my car, Jake tried a different approach. He offered me $200 just to let him peek inside the bag. When I said no, he offered $500, then $1,000. His desperation was scary because I couldn't understand why seeing the dress mattered so much unless he already suspected something. He kept saying, "We agreed on the Vera Wang. We've been planning this for 8 months. The photographer is expecting the Vera Wang for the detail shots." Then he tried pulling up photos on his phone of wedding inspiration boards. "Look what we planned together," he said, his voice breaking. "I helped pick out everything. The flowers, the decorations, even the jewelry to match this specific dress." The photos showed elaborate Pinterest boards with the Vera Wang dress as the centerpiece of every image. "You're going to let her ruin our perfect day over some Bridezilla impulse decision?" When I still wouldn't give him the bag, he actually dropped to his knees right there in the parking lot, grabbing my hand, begging me to just let him see it, saying he was the groom and had paid for half of everything. People were taking pictures with their phones now. I managed to get in my car and lock the doors, but Jake stood right outside my window, pleading with me through the glass. He was saying something about deposits and vendors and how much money they'd lose if Madison had changed everything last minute. The shop manager came outside and asked Jake to move away from the vehicle or they'd call security. I drove straight to Madison's apartment and found her pacing in her kitchen, still wearing her work clothes from the law firm. When I handed her the garment bag, she wouldn't meet my eyes, just mumbled, "Thanks," and asked me to help her hang it in the closet. I followed her into the bedroom and she unzipped the bag with shaking hands. Inside wasn't the Vera Wang they'd chosen together. It was a completely different dress, a simple, elegant design in champagne instead of white. No beading, no elaborate train, nothing like what they'd spent months planning. Madison looked at it hanging there and started crying. She told me quietly that 2 weeks ago, she'd gone to the shop for her final fitting and had this overwhelming panic attack. Looking at herself in the Vera Wang, she said she felt like she was playing dress-up as someone else's bride. She couldn't breathe in all the layers and beading. It felt like a costume for a wedding that wasn't really hers. She'd asked to try on other dresses and found this simple one that made her feel like herself again. The shop owner had convinced her it was normal to have second thoughts about such an important dress, and they'd quietly switched the order. Madison made them promise not to tell Jake until after she could explain it to him herself. I asked why she hadn't told Jake about the change, and Madison started crying harder. She said every time she tried to bring it up, Jake would start talking about how perfect everything was going to be, how the Vera Wang was exactly what he dreamed of for his bride. He'd already posted pictures of the original dress on Instagram, tagging vendors and talking about how beautiful she was going to look in it. She said she felt trapped by his excitement and all the public posts. Everyone expected her to be the bride in the elaborate white gown, but that wasn't who she wanted to be on her wedding day. She'd been hoping to break it to him gently, but now, with the wedding 4 days away, she was terrified of his reaction. We sat there looking at the champagne dress hanging in her closet, and I realized Madison wasn't just having dress regrets. She was having wedding regrets. The whole elaborate celebration they'd planned felt wrong to her, but she didn't know how to stop the momentum of Jake's vision for their perfect day. The silence in her bedroom felt heavy with all the things she hadn't said to Jake over the past 8 months. The dress hanging there looked beautiful, but it also looked like evidence of a much bigger problem. How do you tell someone you love that you've been pretending to agree with their dreams? Madison's phone buzzed with another text from Jake asking where she was and if everything was okay with the dress pickup. She stared at the message without responding, and I could see her hands shaking as she held the phone. The weight of her deception was finally hitting her, and she had no idea how to fix it. Around 7 that evening, Jake showed up at Madison's door looking frantic, demanding to know what was going on with the dress. Madison let him in, and he immediately saw the garment bag hanging in the bedroom doorway. He pushed past us and unzipped it before Madison could stop him. His face went white when he saw the champagne dress. He stood there staring at it for what felt like forever, not moving, not even breathing. Then he turned to Madison with this expression of complete betrayal. "This isn't our dress," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "This isn't what we planned. This isn't what I posted about. This isn't what the photographer is expecting. This isn't what matches the flowers or the decorations or anything." Madison tried to explain about the panic attack and feeling uncomfortable, but Jake wasn't listening. He was pulling out his phone, scrolling through all their vendor contracts and social media posts. Every single detail had been coordinated around that specific Vera Wang dress. "Do you know what this means?" he said, his voice getting louder. "The boutonniere is designed to complement white, not champagne. The bridesmaids' dresses are specifically chosen to not clash with white. The photographer has a whole shot list based on the beading details. The wedding planner designed the entire ceremony backdrop around that dress." Jake started pacing around Madison's small apartment, listing everything that would now be wrong. The flower girl's petals were white to match. The mother of the bride had bought a specific shade of blue that would coordinate. The cake topper was designed to echo the dress's beadwork. Every single vendor had been given detailed descriptions and photos of the original dress. Madison kept trying to interrupt, saying they could make it work, that these were just details. But Jake was spiraling. He pulled up his Instagram and started showing her all the posts he'd made about their dream wedding. Hundreds of likes and comments from friends and family who were expecting to see exactly what he'd been promising. "My mom already bought her outfit to complement this specific dress," he said, holding up a photo. "She's been showing everyone at her book club. My sister coordinated the bridal party photos around the white dress. The wedding party has already done their fittings based on your original choice." The way Jake's voice kept rising made me realize this wasn't just about wedding coordination. This was about trust and communication, and feeling like the person he was about to marry had been lying to him for weeks. I could see both sides of it. Madison feeling overwhelmed by his enthusiasm, and Jake feeling completely blindsided by her secrecy. Then, Jake said something that made my stomach drop. "Did you change anything else without telling me? Is this dress just the beginning? What else have you been planning behind my back?" Madison's face crumpled and she admitted she'd also changed the flowers. Instead of the elaborate white roses and peonies they'd chosen, she'd switched to simple wildflowers in softer colors. She'd done it the same day as the dress change, telling the florist she wanted something more natural and less formal. Jake's hands started shaking as he processed this information. "The flowers too? Madison, the photographer, has already mapped out all the shots based on the white roses. The reception centerpieces were designed around those specific flowers. The bridal party bouquets are already ordered to match." He sat down heavily on Madison's couch and put his head in his hands. "What else?" he asked quietly. "What else did you change without discussing it with me?" Madison looked at me with panic in her eyes, and I realized there was more. She'd also simplified the cake design, changed the menu from plated dinner to buffet style, and canceled the string quartet in favor of a simple DJ setup. Each change made individually seemed small, but together they represented a complete departure from the wedding they'd spent 8 months planning together. Jake's phone started ringing. It was his mom calling, probably wondering why he'd missed the bachelor party planning meeting. He declined the call, but then it rang again. His sister, then his best man, then Madison's mom. Word was getting out that something was wrong. "I have to tell everyone," Jake said, staring at his phone. "All the vendors need to be contacted. The photographer needs new shot lists. The catering needs menu changes. The florist needs to redo all the arrangements. The wedding party needs to know their coordination is off." Madison tried to touch his arm, but he pulled away. "Jake, please, we can figure this out. These changes don't matter. It's still our wedding." "But it's not, is it?" Jake said, looking at her with tears in his eyes. "This isn't the wedding we planned together. This is the wedding you want, and you've been planning it secretly while letting me think we were on the same page. He stood up and walked to the door. I need some time to think. This isn't just about a dress or flowers. You've been lying to me for 2 weeks about the most important day of our lives. The sound of the door closing behind Jake echoed through Madison's apartment like a gunshot. Madison immediately collapsed onto the couch, sobbing so hard her whole body shook. I didn't know what to say or do. How do you comfort someone when they've just watched their relationship implode over wedding planning? After Jake left, Madison completely broke down. She called her mom, sobbing so hard she could barely speak. I could hear her mother's voice through the phone, getting higher and more panicked, as Madison tried to explain what had happened. Her mom kept asking if the wedding was still on, if she should cancel her flight, if there was anything she could do to fix this. Within an hour, Madison's phone was blowing up with calls from both families. Jake had sent a group text to the wedding party explaining that there were significant changes to the wedding plans and asking everyone to hold off on any final preparations until further notice. That vague message had sent everyone into a panic, with people calling and texting, asking what was wrong and whether they should still plan to attend. Madison's sister Emma drove over from Portland and arrived around 10 p.m. with a bottle of wine and a grim expression. She'd already been fielding calls from aunts and cousins asking what was wrong. The family group chat was going crazy with speculation about whether the wedding was still happening. Emma sat Madison down at the kitchen table and asked her directly if she really wanted to marry Jake or if she was having cold feet about the whole relationship. Madison couldn't give a straight answer, just kept saying she loved him, but felt overwhelmed by all the expectations and planning. But Maddie, Emma said gently, why couldn't you just talk to him about this? You've been together for 3 years. Surely you could have found a way to tell him you wanted different things for the wedding? Madison's answer revealed so much about their relationship dynamic. She said that whenever she tried to suggest alternatives to Jake's ideas, he would get so excited about his vision that she felt guilty for not being equally enthusiastic. He wasn't trying to control her, exactly, but his passionate investment in every detail made her feel like her own preferences were somehow wrong or less important. Emma and I exchanged glances. This wasn't just about wedding planning. This was about Madison's inability to advocate for herself in their relationship and Jake's tendency to steamroll ahead with his plans without checking to make sure Madison was truly on board. The next morning, I went back to check on Madison and found both her parents there, having driven up from Sacramento overnight. Her dad was on the phone with vendors trying to assess what could and couldn't be changed 4 days before the wedding. Her mom was making lists of everything that needed to be communicated to guests. The financial implications were staggering. The florist was charging an $800 rush fee to switch the arrangements. The photographer wanted an extra $500 to redo all the shot lists and backup plans. The catering couldn't change from plated to buffet without 48 hours notice, meaning they'd have to pay for both setups. The venue coordinator was stressed because the room layout would need to be completely reconfigured. Every phone call brought worse news. The cake designer said switching designs at this point was impossible. They'd already started working on the elaborate fondant details that matched the original dress and flowers. The band Jake had booked specifically because they could play classical pieces to match their elegant theme couldn't be replaced by a DJ without forfeiting their entire deposit. Madison sat in the middle of this chaos, looking smaller and smaller, as each phone call revealed more complications. The financial impact was adding up to thousands of dollars, money they didn't really have after already stretching their budget for the original plans. Her parents looked increasingly worried as the numbers kept climbing. Around noon, Jake texted Madison asking if they could talk. He came over while her parents were out dealing with vendor issues, and I stayed to make sure things didn't get too heated. Jake looked like he hadn't slept at all, his eyes red and his hair a mess. He was carrying a folder full of printed emails and contracts. He sat across from Madison at her kitchen table and said quietly, I need to understand why you felt like you couldn't talk to me about this. We've been planning this wedding together for months. When did you start feeling like you couldn't be honest with me? Madison started crying again and tried to explain about feeling overwhelmed by his enthusiasm, about how he seemed so attached to every detail that she was afraid to voice any concerns. She said every time she had a different opinion, Jake would get so excited about his vision that she felt guilty for wanting something else. But Madison, Jake said, spreading out the papers from his folder, I thought we were making these decisions together. Every time I asked what you wanted, you said yes to everything. Look at these emails. You confirmed every single choice. How was I supposed to know you were just going along with what you thought I wanted? He started reading from the printed emails, his voice getting more hurt with each example. Messages where Madison had agreed the Vera Wang was perfect. texts where she'd enthusiastically approved the white rose arrangements, photos she'd sent him of cake designs saying they were exactly what she dreamed of. Madison tried to interrupt, saying she had agreed at the time that she thought she wanted those things until the panic attack made her realize she didn't. But Jake kept reading, showing her months of evidence where she'd appeared completely on board with every decision. They talked in circles for an hour, neither one really hearing the other. Jake felt betrayed by the secrecy and the evidence that Madison had been pretending for months. Madison felt unheard and pressured, saying his excitement made it impossible for her to express any doubts. I sat there watching two people who loved each other completely fail to communicate about the most important day of their lives. The conversation kept going in these painful loops. Jake would show evidence of Madison agreeing to things. Madison would try to explain that she'd felt pressured to agree. Jake would point out that he'd asked for her opinion many times. Madison would say she felt overwhelmed by his enthusiasm. Neither one was wrong, exactly, but they couldn't find a way to understand each other's perspective. Finally, Jake asked the question I'd been dreading. Do you even want to marry me? Or is this about more than just wedding details? Madison was quiet for a long time before answering. I want to marry you, she said, but I don't want this wedding. I don't want to be the center of attention for 150 people. I don't want to perform being the perfect bride. I just want to marry the person I love without all this pressure and expense and coordination. Jake stared at her. So what are you saying? You want to cancel everything? I don't know, Madison whispered. I just know that thinking about Saturday makes me want to throw up. The silence that followed was devastating. I could see Jake processing the idea that his fiancé was having panic attacks about their wedding day, while Madison looked like she wanted to disappear entirely. The weight of expectations from both families, all their friends, the vendors, social media, it was crushing both of them. That afternoon, Jake called his parents and told them the wedding might not happen. I wasn't there for that conversation, but Madison said she could hear his mother crying through the phone from across the room. His parents had already flown in from Denver and were staying at a hotel near the venue. They'd taken time off work and spent money on outfits and arrangements for their only son's wedding. Jake's mom called Madison directly after talking to Jake, and that conversation was even worse. She kept asking what was wrong, why Madison was doing this to Jake, whether this was just pre-wedding nerves. Madison couldn't explain about the dress and the panic attacks without sounding like she was being dramatic about details that didn't really matter. Madison's parents came back from their vendor meetings with a damage assessment that made everyone sick. If they canceled completely, they'd lose about $12,000 in deposits and fees. If they went forward with Madison's changes, they'd pay an additional $4,500 in rush charges and modifications. If they went back to the original plan, they'd only lose the $800 Madison had already spent on the new dress and flowers. The financial pressure made everything feel worse. Madison started talking about eloping, just the two of them going to City Hall and avoiding all the family drama and vendor complications. But Jake pointed out that their families had already traveled and made arrangements, expecting to celebrate with them. His grandparents had flown in from Florida. Her college roommate had requested time off work. The flower girl had been practicing walking down the aisle for weeks. That evening, both sets of parents met at Madison's apartment for what felt like an intervention. Jake's mom kept asking why Madison had felt the need to change everything so close to the wedding, implying that it was selfish and inconsiderate. Madison's dad was focused on the financial implications and how to minimize losses. Everyone was talking at once and nobody was really listening. Jake's father suggested they postpone the wedding for a month to give everyone time to replan. But the venue was booked solid, and most of the vendors couldn't reschedule without losing their deposits entirely. Madison's mom thought they should just go back to the original plan and deal with Madison's dress preferences later. Jake's mom agreed, saying the dress didn't really matter as much as the marriage. But Madison started hyperventilating when they suggested she wear the Vera Wang. Just thinking about putting on that dress made her panic in a way that scared everyone in the room. Emma had to get her a paper bag to breathe into while the parents watched in confused concern. Finally, Emma stood up and told everyone to shut up. She looked at Madison and Jake and said, "You two need to decide if you're getting married or not. Everything else is just noise. Do you want to be married to each other? Yes or no?" The room went quiet. Madison and Jake looked at each other across all the chaos of family and vendors and money problems. For a moment, I thought they might remember why they'd gotten engaged in the first place, why they'd fallen in love, what this was supposed to be about. "Yes," Madison said quietly. "I want to marry you." "I want to marry you too," Jake said, "but I need to know that you'll talk to me about things instead of hiding them." "Then we'll figure out the rest," Madison said. But figuring out the rest turned out to be more complicated than either of them expected. Jake's mom had already told her book club about the specific details of the wedding, complete with photos of the dress and flowers. Madison's boss had rearranged court schedules around her planned honeymoon dates. The wedding party had coordinated outfits and travel plans around the original timeline and style. The social media aspect made everything worse. Jake had been posting regularly about their wedding plans, tagging vendors, and sharing details with hundreds of followers. Madison's Instagram had featured the original dress and flowers in multiple posts. Both of their mothers had been sharing updates with their friend groups. The expectation management alone was going to be a nightmare. 2 days before the wedding, they made a compromise that satisfied no one. They'd go forward with a modified version, the new dress and flowers Madison wanted, but keeping the original reception style and photography plans Jake had coordinated. It meant some details wouldn't match perfectly, but both families agreed it was better than canceling completely. The compromise felt forced and uncomfortable for everyone involved. Madison got her simple dress and wildflowers, but she could see the disappointment in Jake's eyes every time he looked at the new plans. Jake got to keep his reception vision, but Madison seemed miserable about the elaborate dinner and dancing she'd never wanted. The night before the wedding, I went to Madison's apartment to help her pack for the honeymoon and found her sitting on her bedroom floor, surrounded by wedding stuff, crying. The champagne dress hung in the corner, and she was holding the original Vera Wang photos from their planning binder. "I keep thinking about how excited he was about all these details," she said. "He spent hours researching photographers and venues and flowers, and I couldn't tell him I didn't want any of it. I thought if I just went along with everything, I'd get excited too." She showed me the planning binder they'd put together, full of magazine clippings and printed Pinterest pages. Jake's handwriting was all over it, with notes about timeline and vendor contacts and backup plans. Madison's contributions were mostly just, "looks good," written next to his detailed research. I asked her if she was sure about going through with it, and she nodded. "I love Jake. I want to marry him. I just wish we talked about this stuff earlier instead of me pretending to agree with everything." The conversation revealed so much about their relationship patterns. Madison had always been a people pleaser, going along with Jake's enthusiasm rather than advocating for her own preferences. Jake had interpreted her agreement as genuine enthusiasm, not realizing she was just following his lead. Neither one had intentionally created this dynamic, but it had been building for their entire relationship. We spent hours talking about how they'd fallen into these roles. Madison admitted that even when they chose restaurants or planned vacations, she usually just agreed with whatever Jake suggested. He always seemed to have strong opinions and good reasons for his choices, so she'd learned to trust his judgment rather than developing her own. Jake, meanwhile, had thought he was being a good partner by taking initiative and doing research. He'd ask for Madison's input, and when she agreed with his suggestions, he assumed she was happy with the decisions. He had no idea she was suppressing her own preferences to avoid conflict. The wedding day itself was beautiful, but weird. Madison looked stunning in the champagne dress, but the white flowers Jake had insisted on keeping didn't quite coordinate. The photographs were lovely, but some of the planned shots didn't work with the dress change. The families were gracious, but I could see confusion on people's faces when details didn't match what they'd been expecting. The ceremony itself was emotional in ways none of us had anticipated. When Madison and Jake exchanged vows, they both started crying. Not tears of joy, but tears of relief and exhaustion and hope that maybe they could learn to communicate better as married people than they had as engaged people. During the reception, Jake's college roommate pulled me aside and asked what had happened with all the wedding planning. He'd been following Jake's Instagram posts and was expecting something completely different. I gave him a vague answer about last-minute changes, but I could tell people were talking. The whole evening felt like everyone was performing normal wedding happiness while dealing with this underlying tension about what had gone wrong. The bride and groom were trying too hard, the families were being overly cheerful, and the friends were confused, but trying to be supportive. Madison and Jake looked happy during their first dance, but there was an underlying exhaustion throughout the whole day. They were both trying so hard to make everything work that they seemed drained by their own wedding. The joy felt forced, like they were performing happiness instead of actually feeling it. The reception dinner was particularly awkward because the plated service Madison had originally agreed to didn't match her new vision of a casual celebration. She picked at her elaborate chicken entree while looking longingly at the simple buffet setup she'd wanted. Jake kept checking his phone, responding to vendor texts and coordinating details that felt too formal for the simple wildflower centerpieces. During the toasts, both fathers made speeches about compromise and communication in marriage, which felt pointed given what everyone had witnessed over the past week. Madison's dad talked about the importance of honesty between spouses. Jake's dad mentioned how marriages require flexibility and understanding. Everyone was giving advice while carefully not mentioning the specific drama that had almost canceled the wedding. The dancing portion of the evening went better because people could spread out and the mood felt less forced. But I noticed Madison spent a lot of time talking to her cousins near the back of the room instead of mingling with guests who wanted to ask about her beautiful dress or the lovely flowers. She seemed to be avoiding conversations about the wedding details she'd struggled with. Jake, meanwhile, was working the room like a politician, thanking everyone for coming and apologizing vaguely for any confusion about the planning. He seemed to be in damage control mode, trying to smooth over any awkwardness while also celebrating his marriage. The dual roles were clearly exhausting him. Around 10 p.m., I found them both outside the venue, sitting on a bench and looking overwhelmed. They were holding hands but not talking, just staring at the parking lot where their families and friends were starting to head home. When I asked how they were doing, they both just shrugged. "It's beautiful," Madison said, gesturing back toward the reception. "Everyone's having fun. The vendors did an amazing job, but it doesn't feel like us, you know?" Jake nodded. "It's like we planned this wedding for other people's expectations instead of what we actually wanted." That observation hit me hard because it was so accurate. They'd both been trying so hard to create the perfect wedding that they'd lost sight of what would actually make them happy. Madison, by secretly changing things, Jake by getting too invested in other people's approval, both of them by not communicating honestly about their real desires. The honeymoon in Hawaii was supposed to be their chance to reconnect and recover from the wedding stress. But Madison called me crying from Maui 3 days into the trip. She and Jake had been fighting about everything: where to eat dinner, what activities to do, even what time to wake up in the morning. Every decision seemed to trigger their communication problems all over again. Jake would suggest snorkeling, and Madison would agree even though she was afraid of deep water. Then she'd be anxious and uncomfortable during the activity, which made Jake feel guilty for choosing something she didn't enjoy. When he asked her to pick the next activity, she'd freeze up and say she didn't care, which frustrated him because he knew she did care but wouldn't say what she wanted. They tried to have a serious conversation about their relationship patterns while sitting on the beach one evening, but it turned into another fight about the wedding. Jake said he felt like he couldn't trust Madison to be honest about her feelings. Madison said she felt like Jake's enthusiasm overwhelmed her ability to voice her own opinions. The pattern kept repeating. Jake would make a suggestion, Madison would either agree when she didn't want to or shut down completely. Jake would get frustrated by her lack of engagement. Madison would feel pressured and defensive, and they'd end up in another circular argument about communication. 6 months later, Madison called me crying again. She and Jake had been fighting constantly since the wedding, not about the dress or flowers, but about communication and decision-making in their marriage. The wedding had revealed deeper problems about how they handled conflict and compromise, and they hadn't figured out how to fix them. Jake felt like he couldn't trust Madison to be honest about her feelings, since she'd hidden her wedding preferences for weeks. Madison felt like Jake's enthusiasm overwhelmed her voice in their relationship, making her afraid to disagree with him about anything important. They'd started couples therapy, but Madison said the therapist kept bringing up the wedding as an example of their communication problems. Every time they had to make a decision together about where to live, how to spend money, what to do on weekends, whether to have kids, they'd fall back into the same pattern. Jake would get excited about his vision and start researching and planning. Madison would go along with it while secretly resenting it. Then eventually her real feelings would come out in a way that felt like betrayal to Jake. They'd fight, make up, promise to communicate better, then repeat the whole cycle with the next decision. The therapy helped them understand the pattern, but understanding it and changing it were two different things. Madison was working on assertiveness and learning to voice her preferences early in discussions. Jake was trying to slow down and check in with Madison more often, making sure her agreement was genuine, rather than just conflict avoidance. But changing communication patterns that had developed over 3 years of dating wasn't easy. They kept slipping back into their old roles, especially when they were stressed or dealing with important decisions. The wedding had been a crisis that exposed their problems, but it hadn't magically fixed them. 8 months after the wedding, Madison told me they were separated. Not because of the dress or the wedding drama, but because they'd never learned how to have difficult conversations without one person shutting down or the other person bulldozing ahead. The wedding had been a symptom of larger problems, not the cause. Jake had moved in with his brother temporarily while they figured out whether they could save their marriage or if they were fundamentally incompatible. They were still going to therapy, both individually and together, trying to decide if their communication issues could be fixed or if they'd be happier with other people. The separation was amicable, but sad. They both acknowledged that they loved each other, but had never learned how to be honest about their needs and preferences. Madison said she needed to figure out who she was and what she wanted when she wasn't just agreeing with someone else's vision. Jake said he needed to learn how to include other people in his planning instead of assuming their agreement meant enthusiasm. Looking back, I don't think I destroyed their marriage by picking up that dress. The problems were already there. Madison's inability to voice her real preferences and Jake's tendency to get so invested in his plans that he couldn't hear her concerns. The dress was just the moment when their communication issues finally exploded into view. But I do think about that day in the parking lot sometimes and wonder what would have happened if I just let Jake see the dress right away. Would they have had the fight earlier when there was still time to work through it? Or would Madison have just given in and worn the Vera Wang, postponing the inevitable reckoning about their relationship patterns? Either way, I learned something important about friendship and boundaries. When someone asks you to keep a secret from their partner, especially about something as significant as wedding plans, that's usually a sign that there are bigger problems brewing. Sometimes, the most helpful thing you can do is refuse to get caught in the middle and encourage them to have the hard conversation they're avoiding. I also learned about the pressure that social media and family expectations can put on couples during major life events. Jake and Madison both felt like they were planning their wedding for other people's approval rather than their own happiness. The constant posting and sharing and coordinating created this momentum that was hard to stop, even when they realized they wanted something different. The financial pressure made everything worse too. Once you've put down deposits and signed contracts and asked people to travel, the sunk cost fallacy kicks in. It becomes easier to go through with plans you're not happy about than to lose money and disappoint people, even when you know those plans don't reflect what you actually want. Madison and Jake are both doing better now, from what I hear through mutual friends. The separation lasted about 6 months before they decided to try again, but with much more intentional communication patterns. They moved to a smaller apartment and started making decisions together in a more structured way, with both of them required to express their honest opinions before moving forward with any plans. They're in therapy individually and as a couple, working on the issues that the wedding crisis had exposed. Madison is learning to advocate for herself and speak up about her preferences early in discussions. Jake is learning to slow down his planning process and make sure Madison has genuine input rather than just agreement. Their second wedding anniversary was last month, and Madison said it was the first major milestone where they both felt genuinely happy with how they'd handled the planning. They had a small dinner party with close friends, and both of them contributed equally to the menu and decorations and guest list. It sounds simple, but for them it represented real progress in learning to make decisions together. The whole experience taught me that marriages don't usually end over single dramatic moments. They end when people stop being able to talk to each other honestly about the things that matter. The dress was just the visible symbol of months of miscommunication and unmet expectations. Sometimes I wonder if they could have avoided the crisis if they'd started with better communication skills. Or if some relationship patterns are so ingrained that they require a major disruption to change. But that's not really my question to answer. All I know is that keeping other people's secrets from their partners is a recipe for disaster. And sometimes, the kindest thing you can do as a friend is refuse to enable someone's avoidance of difficult conversations. The wedding industry doesn't make any of this easier, with its emphasis on perfect details and dream celebrations and social media-worthy moments. The pressure to create the ideal wedding can overshadow the actual purpose of getting married, which is building a life together based on honest communication and mutual respect. Looking back at Madison and Jake's story, I'm glad they found a way to work through their issues, even though it required a separation and lots of therapy and starting over in many ways. Not every couple would have been willing to do that work, especially after such a public and expensive crisis. But I also think their story illustrates how important it is to address communication problems early in relationships, before they get compounded by major life events and financial pressures and family expectations. The ripple effects of their wedding crisis lasted much longer than any of us expected. Even 2 years later, certain family members still brought up the dress situation at holiday gatherings. Jake's mom would make passive-aggressive comments about last-minute changes whenever anyone mentioned wedding planning. Madison's dad still seemed stressed about money whenever he heard about other people's wedding expenses. The friend group dynamics never fully recovered either. Some people blamed Madison for the deception, saying she should have been honest from the beginning. Others blamed Jake for being too controlling about details that didn't really matter. A few mutual friends stopped inviting them to events together because the tension was still palpable years later. Social media added another layer of complexity that neither of them had anticipated. The wedding photos were still on their Facebook and Instagram accounts, showing the compromised version that didn't fully reflect either of their visions. Madison said she felt weird looking at the pictures because they reminded her of the crisis rather than the celebration. Jake had eventually untagged himself from most of the vendor posts because the comments section had become a place where people debated what had gone wrong. The vendors themselves became part of the lasting fallout. The bridal shop owner called Madison 6 months later to ask if she could use their story as a cautionary tale for other brides about the importance of honest communication during the planning process. The wedding planner wrote a blog post about managing client expectations and family dynamics, clearly referencing their situation without naming them directly. I started getting calls from other friends who were planning weddings, asking for advice about how to avoid similar problems. Everyone wanted to know the warning signs, how to have difficult conversations with partners, how to manage family pressure and social media expectations. Madison and Jake's crisis had become a teaching moment for our entire social circle about wedding planning gone wrong. The financial recovery took almost a year. Between the rush charges, vendor modifications, and lost deposits, they ended up spending $6,000 more than their original budget. That money had been earmarked for their honeymoon upgrade and first home down payment, so the wedding crisis had lasting impacts on their other major life plans. Madison told me later that the debt stress compounded their communication problems during the first year of marriage. Every time they had to make a financial decision, the wedding overage came up as an example of what happens when they don't plan together effectively. Jake would worry about Madison making expensive decisions without consulting him. Madison would feel guilty about the extra costs and defensive when Jake brought up budgeting concerns. The therapy bills added up too. Individual sessions, couples counseling, and the separation period when they were maintaining 2 households, all of it cost money they hadn't budgeted for. Madison said the irony wasn't lost on her that fixing their communication problems was costing them almost as much as the wedding crisis that had created the problems in the first place. 3 years after the wedding, Madison finally felt ready to talk openly about what had really happened during those weeks of secret planning. She admitted that changing the dress and flowers had been symptoms of much deeper doubts about getting married at all. The panic attack in the bridal shop wasn't just about feeling uncomfortable in an elaborate dress. It was about feeling like she was committing to a life that didn't feel authentic to who she was. She said she'd been having doubts about the relationship for months before the wedding, but the momentum of planning and deposits and family excitement had made it feel impossible to pump the brakes. Changing the dress had been her subconscious way of trying to make the wedding feel more like herself. But what she really needed was to postpone the entire event until she could figure out what she actually wanted. Jake's reaction to learning this was complicated. On one hand, he was hurt that Madison had been having doubts and hadn't trusted him enough to share them. On the other hand, he was relieved to understand that her secrecy hadn't been about deceiving him personally. It had been about her own confusion and fear of disappointing everyone. This revelation led to another round of intensive therapy, this time focused on Madison's people-pleasing tendencies and Jake's need to feel like he could fix everything through better planning and communication. They had to rebuild their relationship from scratch, learning to be honest about their individual needs, even when that honesty was uncomfortable or inconvenient. The therapist helped them understand that Madison's pattern of agreeing to things she didn't want wasn't just about conflict avoidance. It was about a deeper fear of being disliked or disappointing people she cared about. Jake's pattern of enthusiastic planning wasn't just about being organized. It was about controlling outcomes so he could feel secure in his relationships. Both patterns had served them in some ways during their dating relationship, but they became toxic when applied to major life decisions like marriage and wedding planning. The crisis had forced them to confront these patterns, but changing them required ongoing work and vigilance. 4 years post-wedding, they developed much more intentional communication habits. Before making any significant decision, they had a structured conversation where both of them had to express their honest opinion, including any doubts or concerns. They'd learned to sit with disagreement instead of rushing to consensus, and to explore the underlying needs and fears that drove their different preferences. Madison had gotten much better at advocating for herself, but she still struggled with guilt when her preferences conflicted with other people's expectations. Jake had learned to slow down his planning process, but he still had to consciously resist the urge to solve problems by researching and organizing rather than just listening to Madison's feelings. Their 5th wedding anniversary was approaching, and they were talking about having a vow renewal ceremony that would actually reflect their personalities and preferences. Madison wanted something small and outdoors with just immediate family. Jake wanted to include their friend group and have some structured celebration elements. But this time, they were having the conversations up front and making compromises they both felt good about. I asked Madison if she regretted not canceling the original wedding, and her answer surprised me. She said going through with it, even with all the chaos and compromise, had taught them both important lessons about their relationship patterns that they might not have learned otherwise. The crisis had been painful, but it had also been necessary for their growth as a couple. Jake agreed when I asked him separately. He said the wedding disaster had shown him how his enthusiasm could overwhelm other people's voices, and how his need for control could create pressure that pushed Madison away. Learning to manage those tendencies had made him a better partner and probably a better friend and colleague too. Looking back at my own role in the situation, I realize I learned some important lessons about friendship boundaries too. When Madison asked me to keep the dress secret from Jake, I should have recognized that as a red flag about their communication and encouraged them to have that conversation immediately, rather than enabling Madison's avoidance. I also learned about the importance of staying neutral in couple conflicts, rather than taking sides or carrying messages between partners. Several times during the crisis, both Madison and Jake tried to get me to validate their perspective or communicate things to the other person that they should have been saying directly. The experience made me much more careful about getting involved in other friends' relationship issues. When people ask me to keep secrets from their partners or mediate their conflicts, I now redirect them to have those conversations directly, or suggest they talk to a professional counselor who has the training to help them navigate complex relationship dynamics. The wedding industry itself had been part of the problem too. The emphasis on dream weddings and perfect details and social media moments had created pressure that neither Madison nor Jake had been prepared to handle. The vendors, while professional and talented, had been invested in executing their original vision, rather than checking in about whether that vision still reflected what the couple actually wanted. Madison said she wished someone in the industry had asked her directly whether she was happy with the plans, rather than just assuming her fiancé's enthusiasm represented both of their feelings. Jake said he wished someone had warned them about how normal it was for couples to have different preferences, and how important it was to address those differences openly, rather than assuming agreement. The social media aspect had created its own pressure too. Once Jake started posting about their wedding plans and tagging vendors, those posts became public commitments that felt harder to change. The likes and comments from friends and family created expectations that both Madison and Jake felt obligated to meet, even when those expectations no longer matched what they wanted. They both learned to be much more careful about what they shared online during major life transitions. Madison said she barely posted anything during her recent job search because she didn't want external pressure to influence her decision-making process. Jake had become more private about his personal life in general, sharing fewer details about their relationship and future plans. The crisis had also changed how I thought about my own relationships and future life events. When I got engaged 2 years later, my partner and I talked extensively about communication patterns and decision-making processes before we started any major planning. We established clear guidelines for how to handle disagreements and how to make sure both of our voices were heard equally. We also talked about family expectations and social media pressure and financial boundaries up front, rather than figuring those things out in the middle of wedding planning when emotions and stress levels were high. Madison and Jake's experience had taught me that prevention was much easier than crisis management. The friend group had slowly healed too, though some relationships never fully recovered. People had learned to avoid certain topics and not to take sides in ongoing disagreements. The drama had taught everyone about the importance of staying out of other people's relationship issues and not enabling communication avoidance. Several couples in our social circle had sought premarital counseling after witnessing Madison and Jake's crisis. Others had simplified their own wedding plans to focus on what actually mattered to them rather than trying to meet external expectations. The ripple effects had been positive in some ways, even though the original situation had been painful for everyone involved. Now, 6 years later, Madison and Jake seem genuinely happy together. They've learned to navigate their different communication styles and personality differences without falling into their old toxic patterns. Their relationship feels more authentic because they've both learned to be honest about their needs and preferences, even when that honesty creates temporary conflict. They recently bought their first house together, and Madison said the decision-making process was completely different from their wedding planning. They took months to discuss their priorities and preferences. They visited dozens of properties and talked through their reactions honestly. When they disagreed about important features, they kept looking until they found something they both genuinely loved. Jake said the house hunting process felt like proof that they'd really changed their communication patterns. Madison advocated for her preferences clearly from the beginning. Jake slowed down and made sure he understood her perspective before moving forward with any decisions. They both learned to sit with uncertainty rather than rushing to agreement when they weren't aligned. The wedding crisis had been a painful and expensive way to learn these lessons, but it had ultimately made their relationship stronger. They'd both done the hard work of changing ingrained patterns and learning to communicate more effectively. Not every couple would have been willing or able to do that work, especially after such a public and dramatic crisis. Their story became a cautionary tale in our friend group, but also an inspiration about the possibility of real change in relationships. People saw that even couples with serious communication problems could learn to work together more effectively if they were both committed to growth and willing to get professional help. The experience taught me that sometimes the most loving thing you can do as a friend is refuse to enable someone's avoidance of difficult conversations. Madison had needed to have honest discussions with Jake about her doubts and preferences, but my willingness to keep her secrets had allowed her to postpone those conversations until they became a crisis. I learned to recognize the warning signs when friends ask me to mediate their relationship conflicts or keep secrets from their partners. Those requests usually indicate that there are deeper communication problems that need to be addressed directly between the partners, with professional help if necessary. The wedding industry has started to change too, with more emphasis on authentic celebrations and honest communication between couples. Some vendors now build check-ins about genuine preferences into their planning process, rather than just executing whatever vision the more vocal partner presents. Madison and Jake's story illustrates how important it is for couples to learn healthy communication patterns before major life stressors test their relationship. Wedding planning, buying a home, having children, dealing with job loss or illness. All of these situations require couples to navigate disagreement and make decisions together under pressure. The couples who do best are the ones who've learned to be honest about their needs and preferences, to sit with discomfort when they disagree, and to keep working toward solutions that honor both partners' perspectives. Those skills have to be developed intentionally and practiced regularly. They don't just happen automatically because people love each other. Looking back, I'm grateful that Madison and Jake found a way to work through their crisis and build a stronger relationship. But I also think about all the couples who might not have the resources or willingness to do that kind of intensive work on their communication patterns. The wedding industry and social culture around major life events could do more to prepare couples for the communication challenges they'll face. Sometimes the most important gift you can give friends who are planning major life events is honest feedback about their relationship dynamics and encouragement to address any concerning patterns before they're tested by stress and external pressure. It's not always comfortable to have those conversations, but they can prevent much more painful crises down the road.